Welcome back to Killer Stories. I'm your host, Bobbie Holmes. This week, I have a story suggestion from a listener in Australia. Snezana wanted me to cover Scottish serial killer Dennis Nilsen, aka the Kindly Killer, the Muswell Hill Murderer, or as my friend and host of British Murders, Stuart Blues, told me they simply refer to him as Des, one of the most infamous serial killers in England's history. Dennis was the middle child, born November 23, 1945 in Scotland. His father, Olav, was a Norwegian soldier who traveled to Scotland where he met and fell in love with Elizabeth. After their third child was born, the couple divorced. Elizabeth realized they rushed into marriage and really weren't compatible. Olav was way more concerned with his military career than his marriage or family life. Elizabeth took the kids and moved in with her parents. Dennis was very close with his grandfather and looked up to him, referring to him as a hero. He worked as a fisherman, and when he was out at sea, Dennis would sit by the water and just stare at the ocean. In 1951, his grandfather died of a heart attack while at sea. Dennis was 6 years old and devastated by the loss. He had always been a shy boy in comparison to his older brother Olav Jr. and younger sister Sylvia, but losing his grandfather caused him to become even more introverted. While grieving the death of his grandfather, Dennis often visited the beach to think about the times they shared together. One day, he was there alone and went swimming. He was being pulled out by the current and started struggling. Dennis was bobbing up and down, gasping for air, when he had the feeling that his grandfather was there to save him, and he just gave in and stopped struggling. In reality, another kid who was swimming saw him drowning and rescued him, dragging him to shore. After this incident, Elizabeth thought it was best to move the kids out of their grandparents' home. It was a constant reminder of their loss. Elizabeth eventually remarried. The man's name was Andrew Scott, and they had 4 more children together. Like any child in the situation of divorce and a new step-parent, Dennis was not a fan of Andrew in the beginning, but he grew to respect him as a father figure. In 1955, the whole family moved to the village of Streakin in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. It was a small rural area. Streakin didn't have much to offer for teenage fun, nor did it have any real money-making careers. Andrew and Elizabeth were okay with that. But Dennis resented the fact that their family had little money and wanted more for himself. As Dennis aged, he began to recognize his sexual orientation. He was attracted to boys, but realized the ones that he liked had facial features that resembled his sister, Sylvia. To see if he was really gay, Dennis molested his younger sister. He found pleasure in it. Then one night, while Olav Jr. was sleeping, he did some heavy petting, and he liked that too. Dennis decided after testing his sexual urges on his own siblings that he must be bisexual. Although he was sleeping, Dennis's actions did not go unnoticed by Olav Jr. He began picking on Dennis in public and calling him a hen, which is Scottish slang for girl. When Dennis was 14 years old, he enrolled in the Army Cadets. He was hoping this would help him feel liberated in this small village, allowing better career opportunities in his future. He was not very athletic, but he did well in school. After graduation in 1961, he started working at a canning factory. He wasn't there long before he decided a 9-to-5 job like that wasn't for him. He joined the Army where he trained to work as a chef. He learned the skills of butchery. Store that tidbit of info in the back of your brain for later. He loved it. He enjoyed traveling, and he got to do something he enjoyed. But he kept his sexual orientation a secret in fear of the humiliation and rejection of his friends and colleagues. He showered alone in the bathroom because he worried if he showered with the other men, he may get an erection. While serving in Germany, Dennis and his army friends were heavy drinkers. On many occasions, he passed out and woke up in his friend's flat. He knew nothing sexual happened, but he began fantasizing that he was taken advantage of while unconscious. Then the fantasies flipped. He wanted his partner to be the unconscious one while he had sex with them. The arousal was even stronger when he imagined them dead. Dennis would stand in front of a tall mirror. He'd turn it at just the right angle so that he couldn't see his own face. He imagined it was someone else and masturbated. Dennis was transferred to Norway and then to Almanzora prison where he worked as a prison chef. This area was way more dangerous than where he was stationed in Norway and Germany. The army barracks was regularly ambushed and they lost quite a few soldiers. One day, Dennis was kidnapped by a taxi driver and was forced into the trunk of his car. When the driver stopped, he popped the trunk and reached in to grab him. But Dennis was waiting with the jack handle. He beat the driver unconscious and threw him in the trunk. Dennis was relocated a few more times before landing in West Berlin. He had his first sexual experience with a woman here. He hired a sex worker and bragged about it to his army friends, perhaps to conceal the fact that he was gay. He later stated that sex with a woman is, quote, overrated and depressing, unquote. He ended his army career in 1972. He moved back in with his mother and started looking for a new job. But his mother thought it was time for him to find a wife and get married. She would nag him about the lack of effort to date women. Dennis, a few of his siblings, and their significant others watched a documentary one evening about gay rights. The others were disgusted and made crude comments while Dennis repeatedly defended the documentary. Dennis's argument with the others escalated into a full-on fight, after which Olaf Jr. spilled the beans to their mother that Dennis was gay. Dennis was so angry with Olaf for outing him, he never spoke to him again. In late 1972, Dennis moved to London. The only interaction he had with the rest of his family moving forward was an occasional written letter. Once in London, he began training for the Metropolitan Police Force. He started embracing his sexual orientation and would frequent the gay pubs in town. He had a lot of meaningless one-night stands, but what he really wanted was a long-term relationship. He called these one-night stands, quote, soul-destroying, and that it was a vain search for inner peace, unquote. He enjoyed his job, but he decided to step down and start working as a security guard from December of 1973 to May of 1974. He felt like his personal life just didn't fit in with the police force. In May of 1974, he found a more suitable career path working as a civil servant, essentially a government employee. His position involved finding employment for unskilled laborers, in other words, without education or previous training. In late 1975, Dennis was leaving a pub when he saw two men ganging up on a young, skinny 20-year-old man named David Galishon. Dennis was able to convince the men to leave him alone. David was new to London and living in a hostel. Dennis brought him to his home, and the two started chatting over drinks. David shared with him that he was also gay. They got along well, and by the next day, Dennis had invited David to live with him. Dennis's father had recently passed away and left him a small inheritance. He used that money to find a more spacious place to live. He rented a first-floor apartment on Melrose Avenue where they had sole use of the yard and garden. I don't know that Dennis and David were actually a couple or more just two gay men that enjoyed each other's company. They did have sex on occasion, but it was rare. After a year of living together, whatever the relationship, the pair started to drift apart. They would both bring home men to have casual sex with in their separate bedrooms. They picked fights with each other regularly, and in May of 1977, a particularly bad argument caused David to move out. Dennis says he ended their relationship, but if you ask David, he would say he left on his own accord. Dennis was now all alone in the large flat. To keep himself busy, he willingly worked long hours. His downtime was spent alone consuming alcohol. Lots of it. On December 30th, 1978, Dennis decided he needed to get out of the house, but couldn't think of anything else to do other than drink. So he went to the local pub and witnessed a young man trying to buy beer, but he was denied because he was underage. He assumed this boy, Stephen Holmes, was around 17 years old. If anything, Stephen could help keep him company. He invited him back to his apartment on Melrose Avenue at the promise of alcohol. The two drank so much they passed out. Dennis woke up the next morning, New Year's Eve. He looked over at a sleeping Stephen. He had a great time talking with him last night. Dennis didn't have much of a social life lately, and having the company around felt good. He didn't want that feeling to end. He knew that when Stephen woke up, he would probably leave and go back to his hostel. Dennis really, really wanted him to stay. He grabbed a necktie and strangled Stephen unconscious. Then he submerged his head into a bucket of water, drowning him. Stephen wasn't 17. He was actually only 14 years old. He bathed Stephen in the bathtub and then moved him to the bed. Dennis masturbated twice onto Stephen's lifeless body. Dennis kept his body stored under his floorboards for 8 months. The stench in his flat had to be horrid. This was his first killing, the first of many. Dennis Nilsen stated, quote, "I started down the avenue of death and possession of a new kind of flatmate," unquote. In August of 1979, Dennis decided it was finally time to get rid of his flatmate. He built a large bonfire in his backyard and burned the body of Stephen Holmes. Yes, he had sole use of the yard, but other people do live in the building. It's pretty ballsy to burn a dead body in plain sight. 2 months after disposing of Stephen Holmes's body, Dennis strikes again. He met a young student named Andrew Ho at a local pub. Andrew joined Dennis back at his flat to engage in sex. Dennis tried to strangle Andrew like he did Stephen. But Stephen was sleeping and defenseless. Andrew fought back and escaped, calling the police about what happened. Dennis was interviewed, but nothing ever happened because Andrew Ho decided not to press charges against him. He got away with attempted murder scot-free. In December of 1979, Dennis met another student at the pub, 23-year-old Canadian Kenneth Oakenden. Kenneth explained that he was just visiting London as a tourist. Dennis offered to show him the sights. They spent the day together exploring the city. Afterwards, Dennis invited Kenneth to his home for a nightcap. They stopped at a liquor store and stocked up with bottles of rum and whiskey. They were half smashed when Dennis gave Kenneth a pair of headphones to listen to music. Then, while he was listening, Dennis wrapped the cord around his neck and began strangling him. After Kenneth was dead, Dennis put on the headphones, turned up the music, and downed a double shot of rum. He curled Kenneth next to him on the bed as if keeping him company while he watched TV. When it was time to move the body, he wrapped it in plastic bags and placed him where he had put Stephen, beneath the floorboards. Whenever Dennis felt lonely, he would pull out Kenneth and place him on the armchair so they could hang out and watch TV. A 16-year-old named Martin Duffy had hitchhiked to London. He snuck onto the train to head back home, but he was kicked off when the British police realized he hadn't paid his fare. He spent 4 nights sleeping at the train station when Dennis crossed his path. He offered Martin a place to stay. Of course he accepted, given his current situation. He was tired, hungry, and would love an actual bed to sleep in. As soon as Martin fell asleep, Dennis tied a ligature around his neck. He climbed on top of him, sat on his chest, and pulled the ligature tight. He watched as Martin struggled and faded away into unconsciousness. He took him to the kitchen, filled up the sink with water, and drowned him. Then, like he did with Stephen, he bathed Martin's body, but this time Dennis joined him in the bath. He found him the most attractive yet because his body had the most youthful features. For 2 days, he fondled and masturbated over Martin's body. When he wasn't using him to fulfill his sexual needs, he placed him in a cupboard. His body started to bloat, and Dennis was no longer aroused by it. He moved Martin under the floorboards to join Kenneth. After the murder of Martin, Dennis's murder spree kicked up a notch. He did have 1 more failed attempt, but he killed 5 more people by the end of 1979. Only 1 of the 5 has ever been identified. It was 26-year-old William David Sutherland. Bodies piled up under his floor. They were decomposing and giving off the strong stench of death throughout his apartment. Dennis would throw deodorizers down there as if that would even touch that smell. His apartment was filled with flies and maggots. Ugh, I can't even say the word maggots without being grossed out. There were maggots crawling around their decomposing bodies. At the end of 1980, the smell was more than he could bear, and he decided it was time to have a giant bonfire. He had bodies piled up from murders over the past year. He one at a time burned them in his backyard. He added a car tire to try to cover the smell of burning flesh. In 1981, Dennis killed 4 more unidentified victims in the same manner, lured to his home, strangled, then stowed beneath the floorboards. He began using his skills as a butcher to dissect the men, removing their internal organs and throwing them in his household trash or in a waste pile behind his flat. The very last person Dennis murdered while living on Melrose Avenue was a young man named Malcolm Barlow. While walking, Dennis spots Malcolm sitting outside of his home. He seemed in distress, and Dennis asked if he needed help. Malcolm explained that he had epilepsy. He was taking a medication that helped control his seizures, but in turn, it weakened his legs and could no longer stand. Dennis helped Malcolm to the hospital. A few days later, after his release, Malcolm came to Dennis's flat to thank him for his kindness. After a few drinks together, Dennis strangled Malcolm to death with his bare hands. He shoved his body into the cabinet below his kitchen sink. In 1981, Dennis was asked to move out because his landlord wanted to renovate. He was scared his secret would be discovered. But after his landlord offered him a sum of money to vacate, he got rid of any evidence with one final bonfire and cleared out of the flat on Melrose Avenue. I would imagine even after disposing of the bodies, there would be a foul odor permeating the walls of that place. He moved into an attic apartment in the Muswell Hill district of North London. He had to come up with a different way to hide and dispose of the bodies. He couldn't stow them under the floorboards like he did in his first floor apartment, and he didn't have access to the grounds. Therefore, he wouldn't be able to burn the bodies. He didn't kill again until March of 1982. He invited 23-year-old John Howlett to his home for drinks. Once he passed out, Dennis attempted to strangle him. But John awoke and put up a fair fight. He was reaching out to strangle Dennis. But John finally fell into unconsciousness. Dennis was shook. He hadn't had a victim fight back like that before, and he almost lost that battle. He filled the bathtub with water and drowned him. In May of 1982, Dennis met 21-year-old Carl Stoder at a pub. He seemed depressed and was drinking heavily. He invited him back to his flat. Dennis made him a place to sleep with a sleeping bag on the floor. Once asleep, Dennis crawled on top of Carl and began strangling him. Carl's eyes popped open in fear. Dennis whispered, "Stay still." Then he moved Carl to the bathtub where he put his head into the water. Carl was still conscious, but Dennis plunged his head into the water again until he was satisfied that Carl was dead. He placed his body on the armchair like he often did to keep him company. But Dennis noticed his chest was faintly rising and had a sudden change of heart. He began trying to revive Carl, and when he came to, he told him that he got wrapped up in the sleeping bag and was suffocating. He made himself out to be a hero for saving him. Carl was drunk, but he definitely remembers Dennis submerging his head underwater. It was days before Carl had the strength to move or speak. He asked Dennis about the bathtub, and he said that he was in shock and trying to snap him out of it. Then he took Carl to a train station and helped him on his way. This is not the first time that Dennis seemed to regret his actions. Back in the Melrose apartment, once he laid beside a corpse listening to classical music and cried. Another time, he actually tried to revive a victim, realizing he was too late. He fell to the ground and hysterically sobbed. Maybe he did have a conscience, but it wasn't as strong as his sexual urges. September 1982, Dennis came across a 27-year-old man named Graham Allen. He was standing on the street trying to hail a taxi home. Dennis convinced him to come to his flat instead. The next morning, he was eating an omelet. Dennis snuck up behind Graham and strangled him. He left Graham's body in his bathtub for 3 days before moving him to the kitchen floor to start dissection. January 26, 1983, Dennis murdered his last victim, 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair. As usual, he joined Dennis at his flat for drinks. He passed out cold, and Dennis moved Stephen to the armchair and strangled him with a necktie. He looked down at his arms and saw he had bandages on his inner wrists. Dennis removed the bandages to see deep cuts. Stephen had recently tried to kill himself. Dennis bathed Stephen's limp body and laid him on the bed. He surrounded the bed with mirrors and laid down next to him. Hours later, he kissed him on the forehead, told him goodnight, and fell asleep. In the next coming days, Dennis would dissect and dismember Stephen's body. And just as he did with the other victims he killed in the Muswell Hill apartment, he wrapped body parts in plastic bags and stashed them in random cupboards and drawers throughout the flat. He boiled their heads, hands, and feet. This was an attempt to remove the tissues from the bones for easier disposal. He flushed the broken down body parts and smaller bones down the toilet. Now, my toilet can't even handle flushable butt wipes without clogging, so you can imagine how this became a problem. Dennis wrote a letter to his landlord complaining about the state of his blocked drains. He said, quote, "The situation for both himself and the other tenants was intolerable," unquote. He wasn't the only tenant complaining. The system was totally backed up. February 8, 1983, a plumber named Michael Catron came to the apartment to fix the drainage issue. At the side of the house, he opened a drain gate to discover small bones and what looked like meat was the culprit for backing up the system. Not sure what he was dealing with, Michael called his supervisor at the plumbing company, Dino Rod. It was already starting to get dark, so Michael and his supervisor, Gary Wheeler, decided they would come back the next morning. A crowd of tenants formed around Michael asking what was the cause. He told them it looked like meat, like human flesh. Dennis, I'm sure in an effort to change the subject, says, "It looks to me like someone has been flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken." When Michael and Gary came back the next day, the drain was cleared. Someone through the night opened the grate and removed the bones and flesh. But they didn't get it all. When they snaked the pipes, they found pieces of flesh and finger bones coming from the attic apartment. They called the police, and the findings were taken to a pathologist who confirmed they were human remains. 3 policemen waited outside of the Cranley Gardens apartments for Dennis to get home from work that day. When he approached the door, they told him they were here to talk to him about the plumbing issue and asked to come inside. They were hit with the smell of death when they stepped inside Dennis's flat. That confirmed they were in the right place. At first, Dennis played dumb. They told him that the blockage had been caused by decomposing human remains. Dennis responded, quote, "Good grief, how awful," unquote. The cops were basically like, "Cut the crap, Dennis. It obviously came from this apartment, and the smell is a dead giveaway you are stashing more body parts now." And then Dennis gave in. He actually couldn't wait to get it off his chest. He agreed to go along with them to the police station and give a full confession. They cuffed him and placed him into the backseat of a police car. On the way to the station, one of the officers asked him if the remains stashed in his apartment was just one person or 2. He said, quote, 15 or 16 since 1978, unquote. While Dennis was at the station giving a confession, other investigators were searching the flat. They found plastic bags containing severed heads. One had most of the flesh removed from boiling it. Another bag contained torsos, one of which still had the arms attached. Smaller shopping bags were used to store the internal organs. All of these bags were stashed randomly in cupboards and drawers throughout his flat. Dennis confessed to killing around 12 to 13 victims while living at the Melrose Avenue flat. The remains that were found in his current apartment were from 3 different men, one of which has never been identified. He admitted that he had 7 failed murder attempts, including Andrew Ho, who escaped and called police but didn't press charges, and Carl Stodder, who nearly died but Dennis nursed back to health. The remains in plastic bags had a portion of a fingerprint left behind. It was identified as Stephen Sinclair. This allowed police to officially charge Dennis Nilsen with murder. Dennis never gave an explanation as to why he killed. I think he knew he was mentally ill. He said he was hoping someone could tell him why he did it. When asked to describe the when and how of the murders, Dennis described the ritual of bathing the bodies followed by masturbation or intercrural sex, which I had to Google. It's basically the friction of penetrating between someone's thighs instead of actual internal penetration. He stated, quote, "The bodies were too perfect and beautiful for the pathetic ritual of commonplace sex," unquote. He named Kenneth in particular. He said his skin and body was so perfect it almost brought him to tears. He positioned them sitting in a chair and talked to them as if they were old friends catching up. The bodies that were stowed under the floorboards were kept intact as long as possible. He would pull them out repeatedly to fulfill his sexual fantasies, applying women's makeup to the skin as needed to hide decomposition. Then, once they reached the state of putrefaction, he dismembered the bodies and burned them. He wanted it to be known that he did not enjoy killing the victims, but he, quote, "worshipped the art and act of death," unquote. I'm still trying to wrap my head around what that means. It's hard to prove a murder without a body. Therefore, the only formal murder charge was that of Stephen Sinclair. He was the only victim confirmed by evidence. October of 1983, he went to trial for 6 counts of murder, those that Dennis named in his initial confession, and 2 counts of attempted murder. He planned to plead guilty, but shortly before the trial began, he switched his defense team and pled not guilty by diminished responsibility, which sounds like a non-guilty by reason of insanity plea here in the States. Diminished responsibility means they admit to the crime, but should not be held responsible because their mental functions were diminished or impaired. 3 of the 7 men who escaped death at the hands of Dennis testified against him at trial. He was found guilty of 6 charges of first-degree murder and 1 charge of attempted murder. He received a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. In 1994, it was decided that he would serve his entire life sentence, no chance of getting out. While in prison, Dennis Nilsen wrote an autobiography titled The History of a Drowning Boy. May 10, 2018, Dennis was taken to the hospital because he had been complaining of severe pain in his abdomen. He was diagnosed with an aortic aneurysm. Basically, his aorta had dilated to the point where it ruptured. He was rushed into surgery to repair the artery, but he died 2 days later due to complications from surgery. He formed blood clots and a pulmonary embolism. And that was the ridiculously insane story of Dennis Nilsen, the Muswell Hill killer. Stay tuned after the show. I'm featuring a trailer from the true crime podcast, The Dumb Found Dead. If you're enjoying killer stories, please help support the show. There are a few ways to do this. First, if you listen on Apple Podcasts, head over and leave me a review. It really does help with the visibility of my podcast. You can give a donation at buymeacoffee.com/killerstories. Thanks again to Snezana for suggesting this story and the donation. And finally, you can buy some killer swag from the Teespring merchandise site. You can find those links as well as my social media information on my Linktree in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening and your continued support. Until next time, this has been a killer story.
Do you enjoy dark comedy, puns, and laughter? If so, come join 2 good brothers, John and Patrick, as we discuss some of the craziest ways people die. That's so bizarre, strange, and borderline comical that'll leave you dumbfounded. You can follow this podcast on all major platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and many more. And make sure to follow us on social media on Instagram at The Dumbfounded Pod and on Twitter at TDFDPod. And remember, think ahead, don't be dumb found dead.